My paper interrogates three problematics. First, the use of the term digital native. Second, the limits of the qualitative methodology in studying digital natives. And third, the concept of the real deployed by digital natives. In the interest of time, I'll only present the third and briefly sketch the first two. So first is the first section of the paper investigates the seemingly self-evident terminology describing our subject group, digital natives. What does this term actually mean? We use it effortlessly to indicate some qualities of the subjects we interview, but who exactly are digital natives? Who counts as a digital native? Whence this term? And perhaps more importantly, what are the consequences of deploying a marketing term with a distinct colonial and imperial legacy? How does the implicit anthropological formation of the object of study determine and shape that study even before it begins? As a cultural studies scholar, I'm deeply suspect of framing a research subject in the language of a marketing scheme, and quite frankly, even more worried about adopting the colonialism of an anthropological gesture toward the native population of cyberspace, redeploying the 19th century term devoid of its political and imperial context. On theory and method is the second section. The second section reflects on the epistemological assumptions made about digital natives, namely the assumption that the natives have a privileged, that is to say, unmediated access to their own conditions of existence. This presumption leads us to question the underlying principles embedded in any qualitative methodology, especially those that involve self-reporting. Self-reporting is based on essentially modernist assumption, I'll repeat David's thing, that subjects are transparent to themselves, know what they do, and can reasonably explain why they do it. The term digital native seems to presume some more immediate, more automatic, perhaps more intuitive understanding of technology. My paper argues that digital natives seem to have no privileged understanding of the technology with which they have greater familiarity, perhaps precisely because it is naturalized. Our data can tell us about the behaviors and practices of international students in online space, but we cannot, via qualitative interviews, no matter how rich, make claims about the nature of real social interaction as opposed to virtual interaction. Our subjects do, however, make those claims as a matter of course. What we can learn from them is precisely how their rhetoric of the real informs their understanding of their own actions online, and furthermore point to the seeming hegemony of that philosophical concept. What is clear from our data is that digital natives certainly mobilize the language and rhetoric of the real. In fact, several of them comment on the difference between real and virtual life as though this was a self-evident distinction. This is very informative, not because they are reporting on the real-virtual opposition, but because it is an organizing concept deployed by almost everyone in the interviews. As David's work has pointed out, everything depends on how we define and operationalize the concept of the real. Social networks are involved in serious debates about fundamental aspects of metaphysics. In these situations, there appears to be, as there are in many facets of computing, a default setting programmed by Platonism, which institutes a distinction between the real thing and its phenomenal appearances. Digital natives, whoever they may be and however tech-savvy, don't seem to have problematized the underlying metaphysical concepts, especially the concept of the real, that the virtual world might have or should have called into question. I argue that digital natives have almost no advantage in questioning the parameters of reality presumed by rationalist or operationalist concepts of technology. While our survey population is quite young, the average age of 25.6, they nonetheless embody varying ancient and medieval notions about technology and metaphysics, with one participant claiming a neo-Luddite view that, quote, a world without internet would be better, quote, because computer-mediated technologies are, quote, artificial and superficial, quote. In other words, the underlying concept of the real being mobilized by these young people is one straight from Platonic metaphysics, where the real is coextant with an originary entity and all representations are removed to varying degrees from the source. Artifice or superfice is presumed to be derivative and thus inauthentic. It's very fascinating to see the Platonic schema of appearances and reality mobilized by 21st century digital natives who, following Plato in a reading straight from Book 10 of Republic, worry about the inauthenticity of appearances in the digital realm. As one interviewee noted, quote, people are not being real on Facebook, quote. As Boldorfs points out, there is a broadly shared cultural assumption that virtual selfhood is not identical to actual selfhood. Our respondent who worries that, quote, people are not being real on Facebook fears that new technologies allow for a performance that should be suspect. What this doesn't take into account, of course, is whether or not subjectivity is always a performative. While most of the respondents in our study regularly use computer communication, most of them find it suspicious and possibly lacking in metaphysical authenticity. One student commented that he or she prefers, quote, pre-internet experience, and yet another, quote, I very much prefer my social interactions with people before Facebook, or even phone, quote. The dual suspicion of Facebook and the telephone is extremely telling. A quick glance at the history of technology reminds us that the invention of the telephone was met with precisely the same rhetorical critique, now being leveled at computer practices. In fact, the phone was presumed to create the possibility for deception in social interactions, since you couldn't see the person you were talking to. The telephone, like other new media, it's a new medium too, brought the possibility of mixing heterogeneous social worlds. New media took social risks by permitting outsiders to cross boundaries of race, gender, and class without penalty. And I came across incredible newspaper reports from the 1880s and 90s, which blamed the telephone for causing citizens to go insane. It was really some great stuff I found. So this concern over the reality or veracity of the interlocutor on the other side. Okay, I can't see who's on the other end of the phone. I can't see the real person behind the avatar. This privileges the face-to-face as the only, or at least the most authentic, means of human communication. This too is directly reflective of the Platonic schema of the Phaedrus, which famously poses a new technology of writing. So we heard the Trojan horse earlier. Writing is also a new technology, which was seen as inferior and thus inaccurate representation of speech. And so writing was posed as a threat to the unity and authenticity of the voice. As Walter Ong notes, most persons are surprised and many distressed to learn that essentially the same objections commonly urged today against computers were urged by Plato in the Phaedrus against writing. Once again, our digital natives seem to have bought into Platonic metaphysics wholesale, at least when it comes to their assessment of technology. This is not particularly odd or unexpected, for as Heidegger certainly reminds us, our very understanding of the question concerning technology emerges from the Platonic explication of techne. Plato was thinking of writing as an external, alien technology, as many people today think of the computer. Because we have by today so deeply interiorized writing, we find it difficult to consider writing as a technology, as we commonly assume printing and the computer to be. The dangers attributed to the technology of writing are the template, though, by which digital technologies are today framed, understood, and articulated. This operationalist view of technology, condemning technology to either the status of a mere tool or in a more morally weighted view, the means of some sort of communicative deception, stems from a fundamentally problematic definition of communication itself, one that until only very recently has gone uninterrogated, even and maybe especially within the communication studies field. The presumption of the dominant sender-receiver model of communication depends on the notion of the self-aware, self-present subject, a notion exploded after phenomenology and post-structuralism. As Brianko Chang explains, such an understanding of the communicative subject is a theoretical fiction, a Cartesian-based subject that misses the fact that individuals are constituted as functioning communicators only insofar as they participate in communication, only insofar as they are positioned as a sender or receiver differentially according to the medium and the context of a particular communicative event. There is no a priori self-possessed subject totality, pre-given and decontextualized, but rather an addresser who is first addressed by the other. Several of the interviews in our study commented that while they use and enjoy Facebook, with some of them reporting usage, quote, all day, quote, 24/7, and quote, all the time, they nonetheless accord it an inferior metaphysical status, commenting that it is, quote, less personal than face-to-face communication, unquote. One subject was asked about how digital media helps with intercultural communication and was careful to clarify, quote, I think the most important for me is contact live, face-to-face, quote. Our respondents presume that whatever communicative digital practices they embody, or especially avoid, are in some way inferior, less direct, and more mediated than the face-to-face. Within the study data, it was extremely uncommon for respondents to complicate this metaphysics of the real, with only one digital native commenting, quote, I think our online social life is an important part of daily life, not a replacement for real life, but another dimension of it, quote. This was perhaps the only incursion in our entire sample, even remotely problematizing the notion of the real. The digital natives in our sample are relatively well educated and thus not representative of global diversity of position and status. They are representative, however, of the ubiquitous naturalization of this specific Platonic metaphysical formation grounding our concept of technology. Unlike recent scholarship on virtuality that complicates this metaphysical inheritance, our sample quite clearly mobilized a single set of assumptions about the nature of the real. For contemporary theorists such as Zizek, the real is already a virtual construct, and the difference between the real and the virtual turns out to be much more complicated and interesting. As much of that recent scholarship points out, it is not that virtual worlds borrowed assumptions from real life. Virtual worlds show us how, under our very noses, our real lives have been virtual all along. It is genuinely fascinating to report from our data that digital natives make frequent use of digital social practices which they simultaneously suspect, according to their own practices, less authenticity and even less reality. It is absolutely interesting that in the context of our research, our so-called native informants know just as little about the territory as we do. Thank you.